Afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to day 7. That sounds amazing that we've actually been going that long, and I think it is a tribute to everybody's hard work, both staff and board and TAs, that we've got this far. I think first thing I'd just like to do is recognise the huge efforts that staff have put into getting us the papers. I think, they've really worked extremely hard, and we recognise that was over the weekend. And so I think as a board, we really need to express our thanks for, what they've done to get us to this point. Thanks to members for signifying that. I think it is really important. I think, as Ross has said, we've come a long way, tremendous distance we've travelled together during the year, and really bearing in mind everything, it is incredible that we actually are at this point where we actually have documents that can form the basis for votes. I think reflecting on the what we've done during the meeting, I think we've actually, even during the meeting, we've travelled a long way. We've had some really good debates on some really tricky issues. We're breaking new ground here as a board. And I think we have to recognise that we're doing stuff that hasn't been done before, and therefore I don't think the fact that we're not unanimous on all the issues, I don't think is anything that we as a board should feel embarrassed about. I think what we're about here is articulating the debates, and I think that's where the fact that we will have an alternative view, and thank you, Todd, for agreeing to lead on that one. I think that's really healthy. It's healthy in terms of the way we've arrived at that as a board. I think it's healthy in terms of actually exposing the debate for our constituents. And we have done that on a limited basis in the past. Social benefits, conceptual framework were good examples where there were important points, and I think this is an important area as well. So I think that's right that we pursue that. In going into the discussions today, I think my plea to the board is we have had the discussions. Staff have done, I think, a good job on addressing the points that have been made. But if we can focus our discussions on how have they implemented what the board has asked for, rather than trying to redeliberate points, I think that will help everyone, and it will get us through the material. As Ross has said, we'll work our way logically. I think a lot of the core areas are really in ED 77, so that's the reason why we'll do 77 first, then we'll work our way through to 76, and then we'll come back to 78. So that's the logic behind the order. And I think really what I'd like to do then is actually hand over at that point to Dave to take us through the points. What I've asked Dave to do is actually, in addressing the issues, is to take us through the issues, if you like, bottom up within the document, so that we can build our understanding. So I've asked Dave, from a board point of view, if we can start with the appendix on what we're now calling current operational value, and then take us into the core text and then to the definition. So Dave, over to you at that point.
Thanks, Ian. So we will at least start the issues in order, and we will start with item 1, and this is the objective of current operational value. And I think what we're really looking for here is, has staff reflected the IPSASB's instructions from last Thursday and Friday and flowed through those instructions through the appendix and then ultimately through the core text. Like Ian says, we'll touch on the definition a little later today, but we thought if we could really nail down the appendix and what's coming through there, the definition should be a little easier to land. I was thinking about this last night and trying to put into plain English what I thought the changes were between the last version and this version. And what's really flowed through in this current version is we're moving away from the concept of replacement. And I'll say replacement of maybe hypothetical assets, so alternative land sites or fit for use assets. And what we've moved to is the value of the assets that the entity is currently using to provide that service. And I think that provides good informational value to our users because it's showing how entities are using the actual assets they're using to provide those services. So that was my plain English explanation of what's flowed through the text. I'm interested to hear from members whether they think that has flowed through consistently, and I've reflected their comments from last Thursday or Friday.
So Dave, in terms of walking us through, I think let's all turn to Appendix B now, and then I think we'll go through Appendix B and have the discussion in that context, because I think the you know, when we start off at B1, there are a number of changes there, which is the sort of more plain English version of what turns up in the definition. So I think if members can start off in Appendix B in paragraph B1, and then I'll open for comments based on B1, if that's okay. Dave, you're happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So Mike, lead us off.
So thanks, Chair. So Dave, I think you've done what we asked you to do, but then maybe you've made it too simple. So for example, if I take B1B, the most economic manner to replace the asset is not there anymore. So, but I still think in doing the valuation, we need to make sure that we come up with the most economical manner in which the asset is going to be valued, rather than just replace it with anything that might cost a whole lot more. So I still think the reference to economic manner needs to be there somewhere, rather than just taken out altogether.
Thanks, Mike, and I see support for that. So Todd, you were next.
Yeah, I have reflected on this definition, and I find it quite unclear exactly what that definition means, and I think I'm concerned that people are going to read different things into the way that we've described it now. And I know we talked about replacing the asset out of the definition, but I think that grounded the definition better previously. And so I am concerned in terms of how you would interpret this definition that we have now.
Thanks. So just to be clear, I don't want to wordsmith the definition at this point in time. This is why we're on B1, because I think we need to get at the underlying elements of what's in there, rather than actually wordsmithing the definition at this point in time. So I'm going to go to Patricia and Camira. And I think we've heard from Mike so far that perhaps B is not quite right at the moment, B1, B. Okay, so Patricia.
Okay. Thank you. I think for discussing the objective, is important to understand what the measurement means. In a general review, I think that the broader definition has three main consequences. One is a hybrid measurement in terms of entry and exit value. Second, different aspects of an asset are measured where income approach is used instead of mark approach or cost approach. And third, the measurement based on income approach may be underestimated because of the non-market use of assets. Specifically, when I try to understand the text of Appendix 3, not only B1, I analyzed the three main consequences, specifically about the point here. One moment, please. I think it's instead of the objective of current operational value is to value an asset, use the objective of current operational value is to estimate the value of assets. But only to highlight that it's an estimation, not the value itself. But in here, it's only the point. But I think the general discussion is necessary.
Thanks, Tricia. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are differences of views about the income approach, and we know where the majority view of the board is on that. So we have to factor that into where we get to on this, I think. But focusing on, so if I can focus on B1, I think what I'm hearing is certainly the point that Mike raised, you know, in terms of the fact that B rather goes too directly to the you know, the current use of the asset rather than the economic point, and some of this is how you balance, for example, you know, the fact that, if you like, the key features of what we've ended up with are that it's an entry-based idea, that it's not highest and best use, we're reflecting location, and that we're talking about the sort of modern equivalent asset concept. All of those are sort of key features in what we have here. So the question is, how do we, you know, how should this paragraph, not the definition at this stage, how should this descriptive paragraph, which sets the section up, to what extent does that do what we need, or are there some specific changes? Now I'll go back to Mike at this point, and then perhaps I'll go to staff for reflections.
So thanks, Chair. And based on what you just said, and I think what Patricia was getting at, if you take C as an example, C talks about the current operational value, but in fact, it might be better to say estimating the entry price of the asset based on its current use. So that makes it clear that's an entry price we're talking about. Otherwise, it's not clear at all as to which price you're using. Is it the income approach, is it the cost approach, or is it the market approach? Whereas I think the intent was that this is an entry price.
Dave, you've heard the comments from members. I'd just like to get your thoughts at this stage.
I think we can definitely bring up the concept of entry into that first paragraph. So I've got that noted down to address. Mike, I heard your comment on economic manner, so I can clear that up a little. We did move away from the replacing in the least costly amount when we moved away from replacement, but I don't think your comment on most economic manner is wrong, so I think we can clear that up. And then Patricia's point on hybrid measurement, I think that gets addressed by making it very clear in the B1 that this is an entry value.
Okay, so I'll take Lindy and then Todd.
Thanks. And I guess, Dave, responding to that, the entry economic value manner, would you clarify that in as part of C? Because that's kind of part of the techniques, or is it then something that would be clarified in B, just to understand how you would envisage bringing those concepts in? Because it might be later in the text, or do you think it can be brought in B1, in C or B?
Dave, back on that.
I guess this is just reacting off the cuff. I think so entry value is expanded on later in the text, so I don't have a problem with figuring out how we can fit it into B1 so that it's clear. I don't know the best spot yet. And most economic manner, maybe that's a new bullet, Lindy.
So, I mean, reflecting on this, it seems to me that actually C takes you into techniques, whereas perhaps B1A and B1B are about the philosophy of what we're actually talking about here. So we need to make sure that we get the philosophy right in B1A and B1B. And then perhaps the techniques actually is how you operationalize that, and that's consistent with the hierarchy. So Dave, I think in terms of the just rejigging between those paragraphs. If you're, you know, content, you know, if you can make that happen, I think that will help us, and then that will set us up for tightening this up when we get to the definition. Todd.
Listening to the conversation, I'd agree. I think it would help for the definition to be clear. This is an entry value. I think you're going to have to be very careful if you do that, and I think this is part of the confusion when you read it through, because we're quite clear that conceptually entry value is the cost of acquisition, construction or development of an asset. So we talk about that in our conceptual framework, and that's then driving you down to a cost approach if you introduce the entry value in there. But I agree, because I think it should be an entry value, and I think it should be the cost approach. But you know, if you are going to say entry value in here and link it in with our conceptual framework, I think you're going to struggle with the income approach being part of the measurement base.
We hear you, Todd, on that. I mean, I think the point that we're about here is that this is not exit based, and almost actually that it's clearer to say it is not exit based may be more helpful, bearing, you know, in terms of addressing the tension that you've identified, Todd, if we do retain the income approach after consultation. But I think we're clear it's not a fair value, it's different to fair value, and the consequences of how we work that through, I think, are what we're wrestling with. So in terms of B1, I think the instruction there is that we should be clear about the philosophy in B1A and B1B, and then C becomes about techniques. So I'll take a comment from Lynn, and then I'm going to move us on.
Yeah, I think we do it slightly neater in the conceptual framework, where we talk about it being entity specific, an entity specific value, and I think that might help us and reflects the economic position of the entity. Maybe we could use some of those words which are in 7.49 of the conceptual framework into here.
Thanks, and I think that's very helpful. Yeah. Okay. And then again, that goes to my comment about it's not fair value. So if we talk about entity specific, that's probably helpful. And that helps bridge a bit Todd's comments as well, I think. Okay, so I think with that, Dave, move us on then into B2.
So B2 is largely new. What we tried to do here was explain what current operational value presents in the statement of financial position and the statement of financial performance.
Okay, Patricia.
Thank you. In relation B2A, the amount that an entity would incur to be able to continue to achieve its present service delivery objectives. For example, educational is not similar to the value of an asset used to provide the services. Because this, I suggest to change the text maybe to the amount an entity would incur at the measurement date to be able to have an asset used to achieve its present service delivery objectives. And in relation B2B, the current operational value reflects the amount consumed in the provided service at the prevailing prices, and the asset is measurement. Considering the examples about the use of income approach, I think it's not possible to achieve the kind of information only when an asset is measured if the market or cost approach are used. Then I think it maybe to include except when income approach is used.
Thanks, Patricia. That may well be a helpful way through on B. Certainly, your point about being clear in B2A, I think, is helpful. Again, it's where we've tried to get into that this is not about the services themselves, it's about the impact of the asset value on the cost of those services. And I think we can certainly be clearer on that. Okay, so with that, Lynn?
So I just want to be clear there. I guess I'd be a bit reluctant to start talking about different techniques in this paragraph this early.
Well, I think we have to find some way of bridging this, and maybe there is some text that can be done in terms of prevailing prices, around that to just clarify that. I mean, I think what we have to do is we've agreed as a we will include the income approach in the core text here, and what we need to do is make sure that the text is as precise as possible without causing without causing us problems. So I think if we can leave that with staff, that we need some reconsideration of B2B to address Patricia's point, but we acknowledge your point, Lynn, in terms of when we get into the argument. Okay, and I should stress that I think Patricia was very helpful there in terms of pinpointing where her problems lay, and in suggesting additional drafting or where additional drafting is needed, because I think that's what we need at this stage. So thanks for that, Patricia. Okay, so I'm going to move us on then, and I think that we move on then to B4 and 5. Dave?
So B4 and 5, this kind of comes back to B1, one of the sub-bullets on current use, and the way that we're interpreting present service delivery objectives is that you are measuring the asset in its current use. So if it's a hospital, it's measured as a hospital, and B1 or B4 and B5 expand on that.
Thanks, Dave. Mike?
Yeah, sorry, Chair. I'm going to upset you because I've got a question on B3. And I thought we agreed in all of the text we would take out this reference to in rare circumstances. But maybe I got it wrong. I just thought we didn't need to say in rare circumstances the income approach might be used.
Thanks, Mike. I think you've identified one that got away on that. So I think you're right on that. Patricia?
Thank you. Relation before, I think it's related to the definition. The word support, I think, is a generic because one cash generate asset can support an entity to activity present. So delivery because it help to finance, to fund the activities. And maybe here, I suggest the rewriting the definition, and maybe to be direct if the asset is used to activity objective of delivery service, some kind of things. But I think support is very generic, can include all kinds of assets that not only assets used with the primary objective to delivery service.
Thanks, Patricia. I'll take comments from
one point I think is social policy is narrow than public policy. My suggestion is change social policy instead of public policy instead of social policies too.
Okay, well, I think we'll reflect on quite the description because we're going to have to go backwards and forwards on this in finalising this.
Yeah. Okay.
you know, we hear what you say, but there's also a consistency point with the framework, I think, as well. Okay, and I think that was, so I go to Lindy next.
Thank you. My comment, sorry, is on B3 and just kind of how we jump into the techniques and the description. And I was wondering if it might be premature or there needs to be a bit of a lead in to discuss or link it back, those techniques, to the operational value that we are describing. Or put it lower down, because it kind of looks like we're looking at what does this represent, and then we go into the market and observable transaction. Kind of there's either something, or maybe there's just a description that you should start. Maybe you start with its entry value, the last sentence, and then explain, well, when we're measuring the entry value, you would look at market, etc. But it just seemed to me that it jumped a few steps. Sorry, not very helpful.
That paragraph actually needs to be positioned elsewhere. And I think that was Lynn's point as well. Okay, so we asked staff to look at the positioning of that. And then I'm going to move on.
Yes, thanks, Chair. On B4, I think on the example, maybe we can include in the last sentence already the social policy objective of the Ministry of Defense. So the sentence that, for example, a Ministry of Defense safeguards the well-being of its citizens. That is the social policy objective, right? But I mean, I think it doesn't really present objectively, or it's not appropriate in that particular example. So I just suggest that maybe assets such as airfields are currently used as military installation to achieve the social policy objective of the Ministry of Defense to safeguard the well-being of citizens rather than for commercial purposes.
Okay, I think what I don't want to do is get into wordsmithing at this stage. I think we understand that we need to do something which gets over the entity-specific nature and the fact that these are assets used to contribute to the entity's objectives, however we actually describe that. So I think we're not disagreeing over the, you know, what we want to say, we're just disagreeing over how we say it at the moment. So I think the instruction to staff is to sort that out, but it's consistent with it being entity-based and the objectives of that entity. Mike, and then I'm moving us on.
Yeah, so just a suggestion in that particular case, Ian, I think that the example of using military assets or military platforms, and it just isn't helpful because it's so difficult to value and see what the service objective is. I try and stick to just examples that deal with hospitals and schools all the way through.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll have a look at that, because if the example's not helping, but I think we understand what we're trying to do, that it is about the service delivery objectives for that particular entity, which obviously contribute to the broader public policy landscape, but it's that entity. Okay, so Dave, then move us on to the next section, which I think is the next changes are really on B6.
Yeah, so I'd actually say, Ian, the next section is the asset, and it's made up of the modern equivalent asset and then the location of the asset. So we can take, maybe do modern equivalent as one section, because this is
that sounds good. So in terms of your issue paper, which issue is that? And then which paragraphs we're talking about? Make comments on that as a group.
Give me a second to find the issue paper. It's issue 4. Yep. And then we're talking for alternative site, we're talking B12 to B14. So maybe we'll start there. And what we changed here was previously in the last version, we indicated that you would value an alternative site if it was that was a more costly manner to deliver the service. And now we're very clear that you are valuing the current site that you were using to deliver that service.
Okay. So in your, looking at the paragraph references you've given us, so that's B11 through B14, reflecting the board's, and whether that's reflected the board's discussion and the way the board wants to go on that. Okay, so I think we're okay on that. So move us on then to your next issue.
So the next issue is in that exact same location. This relates to site preparation costs. And in the same vein, we adjusted the text because we want you to value the current asset that you're using, and that would include site preparation costs where applicable. So what we did was we deleted paragraph 11B. Well, I guess it's 11A in the version you're looking at, but they're related to site preparation costs, and it's removed now.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. I've got a question on B7, but maybe I'll take it offline with Dave.
I think if you can, I'd rather keep moving through this. So I'd like to conclude the discussion we've got on modern equivalent asset.
Well, B7 is about modern equivalent asset, and I was just worried about why we say when appropriate. Is it when we're using a market approach or when we're using an income approach? Or anyway, I'll talk to Dave.
Okay. Lynn.
So we had quite a lot of discussion last week about, are you valuing the asset as it currently stands and assuming that it is fully utilised to its full operational ability, even if you're not using it to that? And then when I read this section, I don't think we had followed that thinking consistently through this section. In paragraph B8C, we talk about economic obsolescence, and I wasn't clear if in that paragraph we were saying you take account of demographic change and value a school for 300, even if it's currently 500 pupils, whereas paragraph 11C talks about assuming your current use. Paragraph B18 said something slightly different. Paragraph B19 says something slightly different, and B21. So I got confused in this section, and I don't think we are being consistent. So there's paragraphs again with B8C, B11C, B18, B19, and B21. We are inconsistent in what we're saying in those paragraphs about is it the current asset, regardless of whether or not we're using it to the full capacity.
So I'll just take Patricia's comment on that. I think though there's an overriding thing here, which is that what we said when we discussed it was that this was addressed in the valuation literature, and we should let the valuers do their, follow their techniques, because essentially it did deliver what we were looking for. So there probably is a consistency point then, not only within the literature, but making sure that it's not inconsistent with what the valuers do. I'll let Dave reflect on that whilst I take comments from Patricia and Mike.
Sorry, can I present my comments? Yeah, okay.
Yep, go ahead, Patricia.
Thank you. The assumption about the modern equivalent asset makes the measurement more complex and costly. So my suggestion is adopting the same approach in the IVS, in which the requirements about the modern equivalent asset are restricted to the use of replacement cost as a method for estimating the value of an asset based on the cost approach. Consequently, in the paragraph B7, when appropriate would be defined. It's consistent with the content of EGs about the modern equivalent assets too. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So I think that amplifies that request that we're consistent with the valuation literature. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I had just 2 words of caution in B8. I would drop the word permanent in the first line, just talk about forms of obsolescence. And because later on in the text in C, we talk about temporary or permanent. So I'd rather just drop the word. We don't need it, I don't think. And then I also had a question on where we talk about capitalizing borrowing costs in the next section, B11. Again, I don't think we need to be talking about what an entity needs to do with borrowing costs. Some will capitalize, some won't, especially when the valuers, when I read the valuers techniques that we talk about much later, they tend to always capitalize borrowing costs because it's a finance cost. So I would just take that example out. I'm not sure it's adding anything.
Well, I mean, in terms of your points, I saw nods to deletion of permanent. So I think we take that out. I think the borrowing costs point, I'll ask Dave to respond on that, because I think that is something where there may need to be an instruction. And the point is that under our standards, entities have a choice, and therefore I think we need to allow for that choice, and that's what that drafting is actually doing. So Dave, if you can come back to us, just I think there is an overarching request that we're consistent with evaluation guidance here, which means there are some, we need to check consistency of the drafting at the moment.
So I think that's fair. I agree with your point on borrowing costs, Ian. And then just to say, Lynn, I'll answer your question on, I'll call it excess capacity in a second when we move to that. But I do agree, and I noticed this last night, that you pointed out an inconsistency in, I think it was B9C. And I actually think that example should come out now to enhance consistency. But I'll talk about excess capacity in a second.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So let's move on to that discussion on excess capacity then. On B17 and B18.
So, and Ian, just to be clear, the last point in modern equivalent asset was borrowing cost. I think we just cleared that through Mike's point. So moving on to excess capacity. This is, I'll say in the same vein of as measuring the land in its current location. The board also instructed that we should measure the asset based on the current asset that's being used. And the example that we talked about numerous times is where an entity is using 80% of the floors of a building, should be measured at 80% or 100%. And what the new guidance reflects is it should be measured at 100% because that's the asset that is providing the service. That's what provides the most relevant guidance to readers of the financial information. And then just to close off Lynn's point, we did take out all the other examples of 300 versus 500 students in our literature. So I would propose removing that, hopefully last example that Lynn caught.
Okay, and that's 11C, isn't it, that you're talking about taking it out of? Okay, so Patricia.
I would like to present my comments about the borrowing costs. Can I?
Well, I think on borrowing, I think we're right down in the weeds at this stage, and I would rather just say that we have options within our literature and that those instructions are given to the valuers. Can I just get confirmation that that's acceptable as an approach? Dave and David, you had that discussion with the valuers. Is that an acceptable approach?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so I think what we need to do is just make sure if there's any concerns about the clarity of the drafting, that's what, and that's possibly in the making use of experts IG as well as here. But I think if that's, we've got that option in our literature, we just need to make sure that that's clear. So Lynn, unless you're in on something else, I'm not taking comments on borrowing costs at this stage.
So it wasn't about borrowing costs, sorry, it was about...
Okay. Good, right, go ahead.
So paragraph B21, where again, I just wonder if the example could cause confusion with where we've got to. This paragraph, I think, is aimed at getting at restrictions, but we've ended up talking about different sizes of parcels of land, and I thought we had landed that elsewhere, and I wonder if there was a better example that could go in to refer to restrictions. I accept that restrictions are always about land, but by having an example that talks about different sizes of land, I think could cause confusion.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's a good observation. So if we can have that instruction to staff to revise that, to remove the sort of links with excess capacity, so that we illustrate it. I've got Mike and then David.
Sorry, Chair, I was on to B19. Am I ahead of myself?
Can I just finish off? Can I really just finish off on B17 and B18? Are people happy with what we've got on excess capacity? And then we'll move on to restrictions, which is item 6. David.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on Lynn's point, actually. I mean, one of the reasons that we've got that there is that the valuers would look at, I mean, if you've got this example of a 5-hectare site that's being currently used and a 3-hectare site that would be used, the valuers would say, well, that 2 hectares is surplus and would do something about it. So I think we're going to need to make sure that when we look at the wording that we craft it very carefully to make sure that we're still aligned with the valuation thinking.
Okay, thanks, David. Well, I think that's, that's an overriding instruction as we navigate our way through this section. So we need to think very carefully about the examples and what they're saying from that consistency point of view. Okay, so I think we're straying then into the restrictions area. Can I just take any final comments, please, on excess capacity, and then I'm going to move us on. Mike and then Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So B17 doesn't go on to say what happens to the 20%. If the 20% is left vacant or is rented out, you might then need to use an income approach to value that other 20%. So I just wondered whether the BC shouldn't be more clear about what's going to happen to the 20%.
I'll take Todd's comments and then I'll go to staff on that.
I certainly agree with what Mike's saying, but the point that I wanted to raise, if we are dealing with surplus capacity as set out in B17 and B18, we may need to think about a consequential in terms of our impairment standards, because our impairment standards basically don't apply if you're in a current value measure. And I wonder whether we would need to make that change so that you can at least consider impairment under this measurement.
Thanks, Todd. So obviously, as we've said before, we're not looking at consequentials. Those will come back in February. So if we have that instruction to staff to consider that point for that, for consequential amendments. Okay, so with those comments, then we move on to restrictions and social, what we call social policy objectives. Any additional comments on B19 through 21? Dave, anything you want to say before we get into that?
Maybe just a clarification, or at least how it works in my mind. With regards to restrictions, I think we use the term legal restrictions, and to me, those are restrictions that pass on if the asset was sold. So if one entity had to deal with the restriction, the next entity would also have to take the restriction into account. And an example of that, and maybe this is to Lynn's point, would be zoning on land. If it's residential, commercial, or however it's zoned, that's a restriction in my mind that would be taken into account. If it's and we're not using this anymore, but a self-imposed restriction, that would not be taken into account.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I've got Mike and Lucy.
Thanks, Chair. So I suppose I'm going back to the discussion we had a few days ago when we said what did we actually agree to? And then when I read B19, which I think has gone too far in terms of trying to, for example, forecast demographic changes, local planning policies, and so on. All we're trying to do is, it's getting too complicated for me. I just want a simple statement saying, if there is a restriction on the buildings or the infrastructure, we're still going to value the asset at the operational value, whatever that means. We may value the land differently depending on the zoning, or if it's a hospital in residential area and so on. But I thought that's what we agreed with, that the restrictions would be taken into account, but that wouldn't result in a lowering of the replacement cost of the asset, or whatever the operational current value is going to be.
Okay, so I'm going to go to staff at the end, but I think that clear. Can we simplify to make the point better and pull it back? And I see support from that for members. So Todd, then Lucy, and can I just underline, we are not doing drafting at this stage. This is issues of principle. And then I'll go back to, because we will need to, it needs to be simplified and pulled back a bit. Okay, can I go to Todd, Lucy, Lindy, and then I'm going back to staff.
Yeah, no, I support what Mike was saying. I think the drafting currently, it's unclear whether having legal restrictions affects the value negatively or not. And I agree, I don't think it necessarily does under this particular measurement basis.
Okay, so we just need to be careful about that wording to leave it in a new way. Lucy and then Lindy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My comment also is similar to Mike's and Todd's on B19, and even the example that was given, because there are two restrictions that were mentioned there: existing restrictions on the use of the land and or buildings, and then I think there is a repetition of any restriction on the sale or use of the land, and then the example referred to the latter. I don't know which of this. When you say latter, of course, this is the restriction on the sale and use of land and buildings. But even the first restriction that was mentioned also applies to that example. So we just have to be clear on this. In the example that was given in the first sentence and the example given in the second sentence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Lindy.
Thanks, and I agree. Just another comment, and looking at how it's been expanded or elaborated, we just need to be careful that we're also not dealing with obsolescence indirectly through the way we've discussed in this as well. Thanks. Okay, thanks. I see thumbs up on that. So I think overall the instruction is on B19. That example needs to be pulled right back to focus on the principle and to avoid going too far forwards. I think, Dave, you've heard the concerns members have expressed there about going too far, but also about lack of clarity by making it overcomplicated. So we need to pull that one back. Dave, any comments on that summary? Are you happy with that summary?
I'm happy with that. Just to say, I'll work with, at least as a starting point, with Mike to clarify that.
Okay, that's good. So then we go next.
So Ian, I think our last substantive issue is issue 2, the title of the public sector measurement basis. But I can run through the other ones and just make sure that we've knocked them all off.
Is there anything else then in the remainder of the appendix before we go back on that? So really B20 through B34 that members want to pick up on. And perhaps, Dave, I'll just ask you just to summarise the changes that we would see in terms of the drafting on the appendix. I think that would be helpful just before we go back up into the core text. David, whilst Dave's gathering his thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. No, I was just sort of picking up on the comments about B19. I mean, one suggestion, I mean, all of this is stuff that you have to tell the valuer, because the valuer will take it into consideration when they do the valuing. So I'm just wondering whether in actual fact, the easiest way to deal with it would be to leave B20 and perhaps add a comment that it should be as part of the instructions to the valuer, but also include it in the IG, and actually delete B19 entirely. And I just wondered if that might be a way of dealing with it. But it's quite radical, so I think, you know, if Mike or Lynn might want to say anything.
Well, Lynn's giving that a thumbs up, so I think we're at the less is more stage on this. Mike.
Yes, so I'm happy with that proposal, Dave, or David, get the right Dave, as long as B20, as we said earlier, doesn't result in the value of the asset going down. So it needs to be clear, I think, that we're not expecting these restrictions to lower the value of the asset.
I think we should probably just be silent on that. I think, you know, we need to be clear about the restrictions, and then those are, the valuer is cited on those, and then we let the valuer do their work based on their standards.
So I'm happy with that, Chair, but our experience in Australia has been that the valuers, certainly with the land, they discount the land down to 10%. Some discount it at 0, and others discounted, you know, 90%.
Well,
and I can't, yeah. So as long as we're properly instructing the valuer, that's fine.
I think we just need to be, you know, we need to be careful about what we need to tell them, and then where they need to get on and do their work, and then there needs to be, you know, there needs to be a discussion on assumptions. So be it. But you know, I think, you know, let's not second guess that situation at this stage. Todd, I'll bring you in briefly, but then I'm moving us on.
Yeah, no, just very briefly, I think restrictions do affect fair value, because that is an exit notion. So you're looking at what market participants would be looking at. So it very much works there. But I think Mike's right. Restrictions, in my understanding of the notion of this new measurement basis that we've come up with, I don't think do have that same effect as in fair value.
Okay. Well, with those cautions, I think the key is that we identify the restrictions, and then we make sure that this is consistent with the instructions that will be given to the valuer. Okay, so Dave, can you just summarise what would, you know, the changes that have come out of that discussion on the appendix?
So I won't go through what I'll call editorials, but some of the higher level comments. I've got a general comment throughout the entire appendix that we need to be consistent in our examples. This is an example of this would be the school where we've got 3 versus 500 students. Those types of examples need to be removed, and consistency throughout. At the very beginning, B1, B2, these need to be cleaned up and clarified so that they're well understood. We need to bring in aspects like entry price and most economical amount. B3 was where we introduced some concepts around measurement techniques. There was a question of whether that's placed correctly in the text. B4, this is where the point was raised on service delivery objective. Is the example clear in clarifying what that means? So that needs to be cleaned up. Then I jump down to B8, which is modern equivalent asset. This goes back to the example of the school throughout. Sorry, this is an example where we need to bring the example of either schools or hospitals, or keep using that throughout our literature. And then the question was, where does modern equivalent guidance get placed? Patricia asked whether it should just be in the cost approach. And then the last, I'll say, significant point I have relates to restrictions that we just spoke about, and that's cleaning up restrictions and working with Mike to kind of get a good draft of that.
Okay. So thanks, Dave. So I think what we've done there is to clarify. We're looking for clarity and consistency as we finish this off in terms of the drafting. Okay, so that's been useful. I think then we go back up then. So I think that, oh, do we want to just pick up in terms of issues? we've got issue 9, which is the IG. I think that hasn't changed with one exception. I think I'm right in saying there's one piece that's been added to that.
Yes, so there's one sub bullet that was added. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm flipping to it now. David, you might have it on the tip of your tongue if you want to jump in.
From memory, I think it's something E or something, isn't it?
It's C2E.
Occupancy, I think.
But Chair, with your indulgence, could I also remind the board that these IGs are currently out for consultation with the valuation profession so that we are consistent. But if there are any other topics they think might need to be in there, please let us know.
Thanks, David. And from a process point of view, again, the IGs are non-authoritative. So, you know, we can have that discussion, but we will, members will see, you know, the whole thing with markup back and clarity about any changes that have been made when we see this again in February. Okay. So I think with that, we're through the issues. So I'd like to take us back up into the core text now. And to the sections that you've added there, Dave, which can you give us the references? So I'm just skimming back in my version.
Yeah. So I think it's down in the 30s.
Yeah, it's. I think it's 27 through 30, isn't it? Those are the 4 paragraphs then in the core text on current operational value.
Correct, and these introduce the principles that are expanded on in the application guidance.
So obviously we've had the discussion in terms of settling examples, consistency down in the appendix on current operational value. These are the paragraphs, or this is the drafting that staff have amended in the core text. Can I take any comments on the way they've implemented instructions from last week? So Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm on paragraph 27. So whilst you've done what we asked for, when we talk about in the 4th and 5th line, the value of an asset to the entity to achieve its present service delivery objective, I think the BCs need to, or the non-authoritative guidance need to explain how using the operational value, the income approach, the cost approach, or the market approach can be satisfied in that context. So we're saying we're going to value an asset. There's 3 ways of doing it. And I don't think the BCs at the moment explain each of those 3 ways in the context of current operational value.
Okay, so I think Mike, and I see, you know, Chris agrees with that, for example. I think other members probably will do as well. I think there is an instruction to staff that a thorough review of the BCs is required to make sure they're clear about the board thinking as expressed in the core text.
Yeah, and in the context, sorry to interrupt you, of this being an entry value and an entity specific value. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we're landing on entity specific as the focus. Okay. So I've got Lindy and then Patricia, and this is again on paragraphs 27 through 30.
Thank you. Just on paragraph 30, specifically A, so it talks about entering into a transaction. So I'm not too sure what transaction it is. I guess comparing 30 to B2, I think we just have to make sure that we're using the same I guess, language, because in 30 we're talking about a transaction, and in B2 we're talking about the value of it to the entity in the statement of financial position and performance. So I think we just have to relook at those.
Okay, I'll take other comments and then go back to staff. So I've got Patricia, then Lynn, then Mike.
Thank you. I sent all the comments to Dave and John, but one comment that remains is in relation to paragraph 28, the phrase "in a practice, this entity is specific assumptions may sometimes approximate assumptions made by market participants in measuring the item." In my view, it is not in the case where the entity applies the income approach, because no market terms are generally adopted, such as subsidized prices, and then no lower prices, because this, I think, is not the measure may be so different.
Okay, I'll take Lynn and then go back to Dave.
Thanks. It was back on, it was the same point or similar point to Lindy's, but when looking at the description and including transaction, we say explicitly in para 27 that current operational value is not derived even in part from the transaction or event that gave rise to the asset, whereas in 30 we then say because it's an entry value, we include in effect transaction costs. So I think we just need to be careful when we're describing transaction to get the right answer out of that, so we haven't, because on the face of it our readership could see those two things as conflicting. And then just hearing Patricia's point, I wonder if you need the last sentence at all of paragraph 28.
I think that's a good point. I'll ask that. I see thumbs up on that. Actually, I'd suggest we do delete that last sentence of 28. Okay, so I'm seeing support for that deletion. Mike, and then I'll go back to Dave.
Thanks, Chair. So my question was in 29, where again we referred to the entity specialised asset. I don't think it needs to be a specialised asset.
Okay. Dave, and I see support for that comment. Dave, perhaps you can just respond to the points members have raised.
So I think, Ian, you've actually responded to a few members' points on the last sentence of paragraph 28. The only point I wanted to respond to was on Mike's explaining the market income and cost approach. I think I might actually be able to elevate this into the application guidance, because what the application guidance is supposed to do, or the appendix, is explain how the assumptions of the measurement basis apply to each of the techniques. So it might actually work better in the application guidance, but I hear your point and I'll find the best place for it.
Okay, I see support for that. Okay. So let's then move back up to the definition, and this I think we're not going to be able to land today, because I think we need to see those pieces of drafting clarified, and so that we get this, the whole thing actually hangs together. But we'll take a round of comments over what we have in this paragraph. In this definition at the moment, because I think staff have worked quite hard to reflect the discussions that the board has had, and we've had 2 discussions on this already in this meeting. So I'll take a round of comments, but then I think it's with a view to the fact that this will be a subject too in terms of us voting, but we will have to see that back finally when we've seen the other bits of draft and settled. Okay, so does anybody want to add at this stage based on you know, what's been said thus far? Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I also recognize that the staff made a great job in also reflecting in this definition our discussions of last week. I only have a minor comment in regards to the word present together with service delivery objective. I will just suggest to remove the word present. In my view, is not necessary. And in that case, then also try to assure consistency in paragraph 27, so between the definition and what we present in paragraph 27. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. That's helpful. Okay, Scott.
I guess I'm going the opposite way than, thank you. I guess I'm going the opposite way, Camira. I thought that word present was put in there very deliberate to make sure we're not thinking forward. And so I think that was, Dave, I think that's why you put that in there, because we gave you direction. We didn't want to think about the forward use of it. So I wasn't sure present was the right word, but I think that's why it's there.
Okay, thanks for that reminder. So I've got Lindy and then Mike.
Thank you. It's just on the word supporting, and wonder if it's better to use used, unless there was a deliberate reason not to use used. But I think supporting might take it a bit too far away, but it is about how the asset is being used to achieve the service delivery, present service delivery objective.
Thanks, Lindy. Mike? You're on mute, Mike. Okay. So I think we've got Lindy's suggestion. I think, Scott, you've come back to explain the reasons for having present in there. Lindy, you've suggested use rather than supporting. Dave, any comments or reactions on that?
On Lindy's suggestion, we had no specific reason on using the word supporting, so I'm happy to look into other words.
Okay. So, Scott, you've got your flag up again.
Yeah, I guess just not wordsmithing it here, but is it even necessary? It could be the value of the asset to achieve or something. You may not even need that word in there. Dave, you may want to think about it.
Okay, I see some support for that. Okay. Patricia.
A moment. My question is, I think the definition can comprise what the measurement is. And in the case, I think it's maybe to be more directly, my suggestion is current operational value is the value of an asset held with the primary objective of achieving the entity present service delivery objective and the measurement date. It's so direct about how kind of assets and the focus on the value of assets. I think support is a generic because cash generate assets can give financial support to activity, the entity objectives, for example.
Okay, so I think that the word support is definitely giving us problems, and you know, we probably need to work out whether we even need that as per Scott's suggestion on this. So I think with that, we've dealt with the issues that the board had raised and how staff has proposed or has actually drafted them. So what I'm going to suggest is that at this point in time, we do have a list of changes, drafting changes that and clarifications that Dave will make on both the appendix and then some proposed changes on paragraphs 27 through 30, which explain current operational value. We will need to see a revised version of the definition of current operational value, consistent with comments that members have made today, but also consistent with just consistency throughout, that I think is essentially the theme. And there is also the instruction that the basis for conclusions, we need a thorough review of that to make sure that, having settled the core text, and by that I include the appendix or the appendices, having settled those, the basis for conclusions needs to explain the thinking that's in the authoritative text. So I think we have a list of drafting changes that we will need to see back. I think the main subject to obviously is around the final wording of the definition. And if you look at the decisions and instructions, you'll see the proposal that we should actually have a list of issues where, you know, if the in-meeting issue has not been addressed adequately, that is one of the subject twos in terms of the preliminary approval. Now, as just to clarify the other discussion we had the other day, if those items on the subject to list can't be resolved to the board's satisfaction, and we'll have a report back in February, then we would need to revote. So if everyone's clear on that. Now, the other area that we were very clear on when we discussed this in the board in camera and coming into the meeting is the consequential amendments. We understand there are a lot of moving parts here, and again, it really depends on us getting that core text settled. The consequential amendments will flow from that and will be dependent on that. So in moving to a vote, it's a clear subject to that we will need to review the consequential amendments. There's also a clear consistency point between this exposure draft and 76 and 77. And then the final element of the subject to is that there will be the normal editorial process that goes on. And if that's consistent with the way we work it normally, if that raises any issues of principle which are more than just those will come back for the board's attention. So that's the list of subject twos that I think are on the list in moving to a vote. And I just want to check that people are clear that that is the list of subject twos that we will be recording formally and that will need to be addressed in finalising the exposure draft. So I want to check people are clear on the process before I move us through to a vote. Okay, so I'm not seeing any flags raised at that point. So Ross, if you can take us through into the voting process, and a reminder that we're looking for 12 members or more to support this if it's going to go out.
Thanks, Ian. So moving to the vote on preliminary approval of ED 77 with the subject twos that Ian's just listed, which will all be recorded in our decisions and instructions post-meeting. First, I'd like to ask any members wishing to vote against to please raise their flag. I have 2 members voting against. I've got Todd Beardsworth and Mike Blake.
Sorry, can I clarify? I've got a question, Ross. My apologies.
Sure.
So I'm voting for the ED, but not the income-based approach, which will be an alternative view. Is that one of the three options that we're voting on or not?
No, so we only need one member to vote against the ED to have the alternative view. If you want your name recorded as together with the alternative view, you have to vote against the ED.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with that clarification, can I just check then, are we recording Todd and Mike as voting against? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm recording Todd and Mike as voting against, and they'll work with staff to ensure their views are clearly articulated in the alternative view, which the board will get to see in February. So with that, I'd like to ask if any members would like to abstain. If you'd like to abstain from voting, please raise your flag. I'm not seeing any abstentions. So finally, if you vote for the exposure draft, please remain silent. And I've already noted we have 2 votes against, so no need to raise your flag again, Todd and Mike. We have 1 member absent, James Jung. So by my count, that's 15 votes for, 2 against, 1 absent.
Okay, so thanks everyone. I think that's very important moment. I think that's a good decision from my point of view. If we've done a lot of hard work on this exposure draft, I think it does take the thinking forward in a lot of important areas. Equally, we do have that very particular issue on income approach, and I think it's very healthy that we do have that alternative view. And that will be articulated and expressed with the exposure draft. So I think thanks everyone for getting us to that point. What I'm going to suggest is that at this point we take a break for 10 minutes and then we will come back and we will look at the update of the conceptual framework, which is ED 76. Okay.
Chair, I just saw Rod's hand go up saying, well done. I think we should acknowledge work done at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So thanks, and thanks particularly to staff and the task force for having done a great job on navigating us through some really tricky material. Well done, everyone. Great. Okay, and I think now we deserve at least 10 minutes off before we come back to the business of the meeting. Ross, you wanted to?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to specifically record the thanks for David Watkins, who has provided a lot of help between staff and the board on this. And I know he's put a lot of evenings, weekends, and time in going back to the consultation paper on this. And I do think it's really important as him as a volunteer and the amount of time he's given this project that we specifically record his thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Brilliant job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so 10 minutes, everyone, and then we come back and look at ED 76.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Okay, so thanks everyone for being back promptly. So we move on now to ED 76. Now we walked through this last time round, so what I'm going to do is ask John if you can focus us on the current operational value sections, which is clearly where the changes have taken place, and there may be a couple of other areas you want to draw to our attention. And then when you've gone through that, we've taken comments, then we'll reflect on where that takes us to in process terms. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and hello, everybody. Yeah, the section of the document that deals with current operational value, just getting to it, starts with paragraph 7.48 with the definition and takes us through to paragraph 7.57. So, but perhaps we could focus on these paragraphs, starting with the definition and then the high level.
John, sorry, just to stop you on that for a moment. I mean, clearly the definition, we haven't yet settled that in.
No,
7,
agree.
So go through to here. Mike,
and that will flow consistently, obviously, with the changes which will be made to 77. Paragraph 7.9.
John, I just need to take Mike before you.
All right, okay, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. I had to start with as John's outlined, but I had a question on 719, as long as we can come back to it. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So 7.49 discusses the high-level characteristics. The change from last week is that it's less of a comparison with fair value. I think that ED 77 provides a comparison with fair value, so it was considered inappropriate to include a comparison here. So it retains the main points, i.e. the fact that it doesn't reflect highest and best use, that there's an assumption that the asset will continue to be used for service delivery, and that it's entity specific. There is an issue on that third bullet point as to whether or not we need to retain the example. Personally, I felt that the example is actually quite useful because it demonstrates quite clearly what we mean by reflecting the economic position of the entity rather than that of a market participant. But perhaps I could highlight that point.
Can I just check if any members have comments up until that point, or anybody wants to respond to that point from John about retention or otherwise of the example? Mike.
Chair, I had a question on 751, if that's okay.
Can I take these in order, please? I just want to take 749 at the moment. Okay. Okay. Todd.
I think my issue, as I sort of alluded to in the previous discussion, is really at the definition level. And I think for me, in reading it in the context of the framework, it's important that we are clear on whether it's an entry and exit value, and that goes back to Mike's point on 7.19, I think, because that's where it starts in terms of entry exit value. And I think, as per my alternative view, this is about replacement of the asset. So the problem, I think, is with the definition for me, and it's fit in the conceptual framework, and then that flows through.
I mean, on entry exit, we've previously downgraded that to some extent. We allude to entry and exit, but we don't actually identify measurement bases as entry or exit. Now, I can certainly add a bullet to make the point that current operational value is an entry value, as was discussed in during the consideration of ED 77.
I think, John, I don't want to take that decision at this point in time. I think we need to see how the drafting settles down in 77, because I think, consistent with what you've just said, you know, the entry exit point is dealt with at standards level now. And so I think we need to bottom 77 before we make any change of that here.
Okay.
And we note the point, but and I think, you know, certainly going to Todd's point, clearly, you know, the concerns that he's had in respect of the definition and the inclusion of the income approach, which obviously leads into that, you know, obviously have an impact in terms of his view on 76 and the conceptual framework. Scott.
Yes, Ian, thank you. I was just going to answer John's question about whether the example is helpful. I think it is, John, and I'm not sure I'd understand the point without an example. So I would encourage you to use the example to help me understand what you were saying.
Okay, thanks, Scott. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, so with that, John, I suggest we move on through the section.
Yeah, 7.50 notes the point that we're dealing with an asset in its current use, or the way in which a group of assets is currently used. That current use reflects the social policy objectives of the entity. 7.51.
And I think there may be a consequential from 77 on that.
Okay.
On the drafting in terms of you use social policy objectives, but you know, clearly we need to get that consistency with the drafting.
Yeah.
Mike, are you on 750 or 751?
I'm on 750, Chair.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So why, John, are we referring to an asset or a group of assets? Don't we generally talk about classes of assets?
I think it's an acknowledgement that sometimes an asset may not contribute on its own. It may need to be considered as part of a group, but I don't think it's particular. I mean, if that's going to confuse, given that we're generally talking about an asset, I can certainly delete that.
And I'm not suggesting delete it. I think change of an asset or a class of assets.
Well, yeah. I think that goes too far. I see disagreement with that proposal. So I think I'm going to suggest that, John, you take that away.
Yeah.
The proposal is to just talk about an asset singular, and I think we need to see whether there's any merit in referring to some, you know, group of assets or however it's described. And I think then that becomes a question of consistency with our literature elsewhere. So I think we look to have a recommendation back on that one.
Okay.
So take us on 7.51.
7.51 again refers to service delivery objectives, and it brings in the notion of an optimized approach. So that is actually retained from the discussion of replacement costs, which is in the current framework. It then discusses the need to base the value on a modern equivalent asset, where that modern equivalent asset would provide the same service potential more efficiently.
John, if I can bring Lynn in at that point.
Yeah.
So I was happy with this, where we talk about the modern equivalent asset. We've just, the optimized approach now just sort of sits as a hanging sentence mid-paragraph, and I wondered if it was actually needed. I would be potentially in favour of taking that paragraph out to avoid any confusion around capacity and optimizing the capacity in the school of 500 versus the school of 300 again. And I just wondered if it would be better if that sentence in the middle of the paragraph was taken out to avoid confusion.
Okay, and I see support for that. I'll take comments from, and I think that may have been Lucy's point as well, Mike and then Camira.
A very minor point, Chair. I just wondered if the word value in the first line meant to be struck out. I thought it should stay.
Yeah, we'll pick that one up.
Should. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, Camira.
Sure. Here, in regards to the modern and equivalent asset, I would suggest to keep consistency with the ED 77, where we mentioned where appropriate. So instead of being so prescriptive, so just adding the when appropriate at the start, before saying that the modern equivalent asset, the current value is based on the modern equivalent asset, only where appropriate. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira. David.
Thanks, Ian. Picking up on that point, I just wondered whether that section on the modern equivalent asset is appropriate in a conceptual framework. Is that not more a standards level?
Yeah.
I mean, that may well be the case, that now that we have 77, actually, we don't need that because that's dealt with. So I think perhaps we can have that suggestion that we either take it out completely, or if we refer to the concept, it's a high-level discussion.
Could I respond on that?
John?
Well, I think we need something in the framework to the effect that, you know, we either have a reference to a modern equivalent asset or some reference to optimization, because I think that is quite an important aspect of the measurement basis, that we're not just valuing the asset in its current use. We are taking into account whatever you want to call it, optimization or modern equivalence.
Okay, I mean, I'm getting support for the, you know, that we do need discussion. I think the question is how we do that, and probably we need less text than we have at the moment. So I
certainly agree with that. I mean, I don't think that there's a need for both optimization and, you know, modern equivalent.
Okay. So I think if we leave you to bring us back a proposal on that, consistent with how we finalise the text on modern equivalent asset value, particularly in the appendix, we've obviously been through that this morning, and we've got the links through then into the valuation guidance as well. So if we can do it consistently with that, so we get the high level concept. Okay.
Yeah.
So moving on then.
7.52 is a slightly amended paragraph taken from the existing, retained from the existing framework, because I felt that it was relevant to current operational value as it had been to replacement cost.
Okay, moves on then to 7.54.
Sorry, 7.53. Again, that's more or less retained from the current wording of the framework on replacement cost, because I felt that that was still relevant.
Mike.
So thanks, Chair. John, I just had a question with the first line. The cost of services are reported in current terms when based on current operational value, but that's only the extent of depreciation or impairment, not the full cost of services. Is that sentence accurate?
Well, we've used that wording in the current framework, and I've retained it. I take your point, and if we go back to the measurement objective, one of the reasons why there was a proposal to slightly modify the ordering in the measurement objective was because it's going to be a contribution to the reporting in current terms. It's not going to be the whole picture.
The whole cost, yeah.
Yeah.
So, John, I think we get the sense here. I think Mike's point is right, that we need to revisit the wording. Yeah. And my suggestion would be that we bottom out the definition of current operational value, because that's in essence where we're trying to bridge these notions, and then we get the wording right here.
Yeah. I mean, without wordsmithing, I mean, I would have preferred the cost of services are facilitated, something like that, which is less assertive. So I certainly see Mike's point, but I will take that on board for bringing back in February.
Okay, thank you.
Now, 7.54 discusses the contribution to operational value. And again, the wording is not greatly different, hardly different at all from that in the current framework, because I felt that the advantages in terms of operational capacity are pretty much the same as for replacement cost. Operational value, rather.
Okay.
Similarly with 7.55, I've made it, that is more or less the same. It's been modified to reflect the point that I think was raised by Patricia at the last meeting, that we needed to refer to both generation of economic benefits as well as proceeds of sale. Okay.
Okay, thanks, John. And Patricia indeed wants to come in at that point, so I suspect we might quite have landed that right, Patricia.
Thank you. My point is related to 7054, because as indicated, current operational value provides a useful measurement of resources available if the entity uses the entry value. Then it's necessary to address the problem related to entry and exit value. Maybe in common approach it's not.
Yeah, can I respond to that, Ian?
Yeah, sure.
I've had a dialogue with Patricia on this, and Patricia's view is, as Patricia's very clearly expressed it, that this paragraph doesn't really work if the income approach is applied as a technique. I mean, the way I responded to Patricia was by saying, well, the framework doesn't actually get into techniques. Therefore, I felt this paragraph was still valid.
Well, I think we're not
the essence of it.
We're not going to resolve that point now. And I guess the question is actually, do we need the paragraph itself? So I think either we delete, or there's clearly some work that needs to be done to get the drafting correct. Patricia?
I think that if the decision is to maintain only kind of value entry, for example, I think the alternative view is not applicable. Because when I think about the income approach, I think the cash do the use of the assets, and cash do the use of the assets is exit value. Because this, I think there are two alternatives. So in relation to the broader definition, I think it's necessary to admit the measure that has hybrid characteristics related to in terms of the entry and exit value. I think it's, in my view, it's only in my view, it's only the way to address the definition in the broader way. Admit the measure that promotes the entry and exit value.
Okay.
Then there are consequences in the conceptual framework too.
Okay,
in my view.
So I think we understand the point you're raising there, Patricia, and I think we have to take that offline. My suggestion here would be that we either change the wording on this or we delete it here, because I think it may be too specific in this context. And
we can't delete the paragraph completely because we've got to say something about operational capacity, so we need to replace it.
Okay, well, in which case then we take the wording away and we fix the drafting. Okay, so that's the instruction on that one. Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say you can't take it away because the next section deals with financial capacity. You've either got to take that out as well. So I think it's got to stay in and we've got to get the words right.
Okay, I get the point. We'll fix the drafting. Okay, right. Let's move us on to 7.55.
Well, we've already, I've alluded to that. I think the only issue is whether the final sentence is too categorical. I personally think that it's appropriate, and I think we're right to be quite assertive on this. But I have picked up a view that it, rather than saying it therefore does not facilitate, it therefore may not facilitate.
Well, I see support for that.
Okay. Sorry, support for what? Diluting or retaining as worded?
May, I think.
May, okay, yeah, point made. Take that away. Now, under the 7.56 deals with how this measurement basis meets the QCs. The point raised last week by Lindy and others is that as drafted, it was negative. So what I've done is I've added a sentence to the start, and actually that doesn't read well. It should be, because it focuses on the value of an asset or assets. The state, anyway, the sentiment is that the information is both relevant and faithfully representative, and that's to balance the rather more reserved discussion later in that paragraph. Okay, so we accept you're going to take the start of that paragraph and sort that out. Yeah, it shouldn't be measures, so I apologise for that. And there's an occupational value crept in. So I've taken one out, but put in another, which is not very clever. It should be in current operational value. Apologies. Okay, so I've got Camira and then Lindy.
Thanks. Yes, I think the first phrase, it helps a lot in making the paragraph a bit more positive, but at the end, we should also add something positive, because otherwise, when you read the last sentence, you are like demotivated of using this measurement basis. So if we can add something positive at the end, or something like, however, this is good to use because of this or that, so it will be better.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, point taken. Does have a very downbeat note at the moment. And I see support for that from change from other board members as well. So I'll go to Lindy.
Thank Thank you. My comment is on the last sentence, and I wonder if we need it, because if it's relevant, you should be able to understand it.
Oh, yeah.
And what we're saying, so maybe just remove it and replace it with
So,
something.
so this is the one current operational value information, Lindy, that you're proposing.
Yeah.
Okay, and I see support for that.
Okay.
David.
Thank you. So, I think it might be a follow-on to Camira's point, but I'm not too sure. I just wondered whether the sentence, in some circumstances, calculation of current operational value is complex and subjective judgments are required. That's actually true of other bases as well. I mean, fair value can be complex in certain circumstances. So I wonder why we're making something of that here. And if we actually deleted it, it would actually perhaps take away some more of the negativity.
There's a knock on to the next sentence, David, because the two sentences have to be considered together, but I take your point.
Lynn.
Well, I think it knocks onto the entirety of the rest of the paragraph. So I think it would be with caution to take that out.
Okay, I mean, I think, you know, I think let's have a look at consistency just with what we've got in other sections. But I think the sense here is that this is actually kind of making it unnecessarily negative, and it probably gets down into the operational side, which as has been pointed out, there are other issues, for example, with fair value as a basis in terms of how that's operationalized and so on. So I think the instruction here, John, is actually to take this paragraph away and have another look at it, consistent with the comments that have been made, so that we can balance right. And I think also so that it's consistent with the sort of equivalent paras on other bases.
Yeah, I certainly very much acknowledge the point that's being raised that, you know, fair value can be complex. So possibly to even out the language in, you know, both in the QC section of fair value with, and compare it with the QC section in this section in under current operational value. So I would do that, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. So then we move on to 7.57.
Yeah, that more or less retains what was there about what was in the current framework on replacement cost. The term procurement opportunities has been replaced at the suggestion, I think, of Lynn. Otherwise, I think the overall thrust of the analysis is still relevant.
Okay, thanks for that.
And that takes us through that section.
John, sorry, I want to bring Scott in.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was late. I guess just a question. I thought we were not including the word service potential. I thought that was a word we were eliminating and going to service delivery. I didn't know. It's just a question. I thought we were getting rid of that.
Right. Thanks for raising that, Scott. I mean, Dave and I did discuss this because obviously service potential has been more or less, well, I think it has been removed from ED 77. I thought of whether I should take it out completely. However, it is pervasive both to the framework and the literature generally. So I didn't think it appropriate to delete all references. We will be looking at the description of service potential in phase 2 of the project. And I think that we can deal with some of the difficulties and ambiguities which have arisen with the current description, which for those interested in paragraph 5.8. And by so doing, I think that the reference to service potential will still be appropriate. You know,
okay. But I think let's not get ahead of ourselves on that one, because there are a number of problems with what we've got at the moment, in that it refers to capacity and other things. So let's just not get into that at this point in time.
Yeah, but the point being that I didn't think that a wholesale removal of service potential, you know, would reconcile with elsewhere in the framework and the broader literature.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. So that takes us through the current operational value section of the frame of the drafting, and that's where the majority of changes come in. I think there might be one or two other areas that you want to draw members' attention to, John, at this point.
Well, just to note that the value in use section included a discussion, and this was in the first part of deleted 7.63, of what should be done where an asset is used for both service provision and the generation of economic benefits. And that has now been elevated to the start of the section on measurement bases for assets in current value. Okay.
So give us the reference on that, John, where it's gone.
Yeah, can you bear with me and I will. Right. Yeah, this is paragraphs. This is paragraph 7.35. Okay.
Sorry, so just check the comments on that movement, Todd.
Yeah, on reading paragraph 7.35, and I think it was thinking about one of the examples that might have been in 78, I can't remember where I read it, about, I think it was a hospital that was primarily cash generating, so private patients, but did have a wing for more for public benefit. And I was reflecting on that and thinking, should this all be about what it's primarily held for, or could there be situations where you actually want to split the asset into component parts and value one, you know, the for-profit one on a fair value basis, but the part of the hospital that was used, you know, in a social capacity, using the other measurement basis. So I did stop when I read paragraph 7.35, having thought about ED 78, I think the example was in, and wondered whether we'd quite got that right. So question mark over that now for me.
Okay, before you respond, John, I'll take Scott.
Yeah, thank you. And it may be viewed as an editorial. This paragraph is also 7.63. John, you've got it, the exact paragraph in two different locations. Just so we don't confuse our readers, the way you've written the sentence is you've aligned operational capacity with fair value and financial capacity of current value. So I would suggest you align those two so that we don't confuse our readers.
Thanks.
Yeah, the reference in 7.63 is really a cross-reference. I haven't yet put paragraph reference in, and it's simply explaining why value in use is limited to impairment.
Yeah. John, my point is it's exactly the same sentence. So
yeah,
if you make the change here, change it back there.
Yeah, I'll look at that.
The usage of the 7.35 right, and then just make literally cross-reference rather than paraphrasing in 7.63 with everything that goes with that.
Yeah, will do. I mean, responding to Todd's point.
Can I just take Lindy first? And then you can come back on
that. Thanks. And it's linked to what the 7.63 and 3.5. So note that my view of including income approach under current operational value is because I think that some of these assets can generate economic benefits. But I think the board, I think we've decided that it's non-cash equals operational value and cash generating is financial capacity. So there is a bit of a tension there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this does, you know, again, this is a consistency point with where we've got to in 78. John.
Well, the approach which has been adopted in the literature is that we do take a binary approach. For instance, if you look at IPSASB 21, an entity has to form a professional judgment whether an asset is primarily held for cash generation, or purposes or non-cash generating purposes, with a presumption that an asset is held for non-cash generating purposes. So really, this is aligned with the current literature. Now, I take Todd's point that there may be componentization or unit of account approach. So if you've got a hospital which is primarily a public hospital but has a wing for private patients, and I think that example is discussed in 21, I think you've got to make a judgment whether you consider that hospital as one unit and decide that it is primarily held for operational capacity, or whether you decide that you have got two assets. And you should.
Well, look, John, I think at this point, what I don't want to get into is the precise operation of IPSAS 21 versus IPSAS 26. We have brought drafting in to, I think, ED 78 to try and address this. I think we need to have a look at what's been said in each of those situations and make sure that the greyness which is actually introduced and that judgment point is actually reflected appropriately back up here, because we're not at standards level here. And it may well be that what is a rebuttable presumption, or however you frame it in 21, it isn't. We need some slightly different wording or some looser wording at this point in.
Yeah, well, I didn't suggest bringing 21's wording into here. I was.
But what I'm saying is, I think the resolution on this is not to redebate at this stage. It's actually, I think we know what we're aiming for. We just need to get the consistency between the various different sources. Lynn, I'm going to take a final comment on this, and then I am going to move us on, because I think we've got the sense of where we need to get to.
Yeah, I was just going to pretty much echo what you're saying, and it would seem odd to me to be talking down at a measurement technique level in the conceptual framework.
Yeah, that's probably quite helpful in thinking through what needs to go here as opposed to what needs to go at standards level. Okay, Mike, and then I want to move on from this point. I think we've debated it enough.
Yeah, I agree, Chair. I just wanted to go back to 719, if that's okay.
Yep.
Yep, that's fine. Take us back there.
So thank you. So John, the issue for me is around how we've defined an exit value. So we said the exit value reflects the amount derived from the use of the asset and the economic benefits. I thought that IFRS 13 only talked about from the price from the sale of the asset. So if you're saying there's an implicit, the sale price implicitly reflects the benefits of the use of the asset, aren't we double counting?
Well, I don't think so. No, I mean, this doesn't reflect IFRS 13, but I think it reflects the generally accepted use of the term exit value. And if you recall, we did actually make one stage elsewhere in the framework. We talked about exit value being the proceeds of sale, and the view was expressed that that was oversimplistic and it missed the what's said here, the amount derived from use of the asset. But I can go back and look at how other standard setters have used that term, and confirm or otherwise the interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I think with that, what we've done is we've gone through the changes that staff have made in response to the instructions from our discussion the other day. We've got a list of clarifications and consistency points, both within the section and also with other standards. Clearly, there's a strong interrelationship with ED 77 here and how we finalise these points in ED 77 on current operational value with finalising the drafting on this section. Lynn.
So I think, well, my comment is on paragraph 7.27, where I think, John, you have amended this paragraph in response to previous comments where we were mixing current value in. I think this paragraph, though, should be referring to depreciation and amortization, though, because in paragraph 734, it refers back to 727 and assumes that 727 refers to includes depreciation and amortization. So I wonder if you could just look at that.
Yeah, will do.
Thanks, and that's a consistency point with 77, I think, there. Okay, so then if we look at the decisions and instructions, so working back up the bullet points in yellow, resolution of significant issues identified, in terms of 76, I think we should have resolution of the issues, the drafting issues that we've identified today, the consistency issues there. We would have that consistency review across the EDs, and I think the discussion we've just had underlines that there's particular with 77, but also with 76. And then there would be the resolution of significant issues identified during the editorial process. So those are the sort of subject twos. Now, I think there's are there any more process issues, Ross, that we need to discuss at this stage?
No, I don't think there's any additional process issues. I think similar to ED 77, we'd be asking for a vote on preliminary approval, subject to the 3 items you've just listed, which will capture in decisions and instructions in minutes. And then staff will work to finalize those with all the EDs and for the February check-in session where we'll look to finalize those approvals.
Okay, thanks. Lynn, on process.
Can I just clarify on, I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, but I think we are still due to see the BCs. I know they're not authoritative, but they do represent how we've come to our conclusions. So is that a definite subject too in terms of the vote that's about to take place?
Yes, thanks, Lynn. You're right to point that out. Yeah. Okay.
I'll just add on that, Ian, that what you'll see in February is the new BCs integrated into the existing BCs with deletion of those existing BCs which are no longer representative of the board's view.
Thanks, John. Okay.
And just on that, I'll note the instructions do have the delete the BCs, and I'll just move that from the instructions up to an actual subject to, as Lynn suggested.
Good. Okay. Thanks for that, Ross. Okay. So with that, Ross, if you can move us into the voting process.
Thanks. So again, preliminary approval of ED 76, subject to the 4 items just discussed, which will be documented. Could I please ask anybody wishing to vote against the ED to please raise their flag? I note 1 vote against, Todd Beardsworth, and we'll work with Todd to capture his alternative view. I assume, Todd, you'll want to put an alternative view forward on this one as well.
Yeah, I think it will be important to establish a brief alternative view here, and then link it through to the ED77 alternative view.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Okay, Ross.
Yep. Next, I'd like to ask if anyone would like to abstain from voting for this preliminary approval to please raise their flag. I'm not seeing any votes to abstain. And then lastly, if anybody, if you don't approve this, please stay, or if you do approve, stay silent. And Todd, no need to raise your flag. I've noted your vote against. We have one absent today, James Jung. So that would be 16 votes for, 1 against, 1 absentee.
Okay, so thanks for that, Ross. Thanks, John, for the work you've put in. Your knowledge of this has been invaluable, it really has. And thanks everyone for you know, the work put in on this generally. I think as a team, you know, we have now achieved the 5 approvals that we were looking for at this meeting, which I think is a fantastic achievement, you know, given what we've all been facing. So just fantastic, and I think it reflects really well on us as a board and as staff and TAs and observers. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now,
thanks from me.
Thanks, John. So if I can just then, conscious of time, we are going to run slightly over, I'm afraid, on this, but I think it's important that we return to those subject twos on ED78 and see to what extent staff have actually addressed the points that we raised. In terms of the other items on the agenda, decisions and instructions, I think you know, we'll need to see a slightly updated version of that consistent with where we've got to today. But what I'm going to propose is on this occasion, I think we'll need to clear those electronically after the meeting, but it'll be important we get those right, because obviously that will form the foundation for what we take into February. And then I think, Ross, will take your just final comments resulting from the Programme and Technical Director's report. So we will be a little late in finishing compared to the advertised time, but I hope people will bear with us just in terms of a walk through those issues that we had left on 78, and then finish off with Ross's Programme and Technical Director's comments at the end. Okay, so we move back on to ED78, and I think, Dave, you're going to lead us through this item.
Thanks, Ian. So the one opening remark is this document set up a little differently than the subject twos for ED77. We did attach as appendices all the changes we made to ED78. So as a result, we won't need to flip back and forth between the documents. With that, I'll move into issue 1, and this was the fair value option. Members asked for a few things here. Members asked for the core text to be finessed a little and to be clarified on financial capacity and operating capacity. They asked for the BCs to be updated and for an SMC to be developed. With regards to the core text in the application guidance, I had some help from some members in writing the core text, and what we ended up doing here was instead of having 2 paragraphs, one for current operational value and one for fair value, we put them all into 1 paragraph so that they're at the same level in determining which measurement basis to apply. And we introduce financial and operating capacity in the core text, and then we expand on that in the application guidance. The BCs have been updated to reflect this, and we'll talk about an SMC later in issue, I think 9 it is.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I think really what we're doing is we're focusing on the appendices here, aren't we, in terms of the additional paragraphs 29 through 32, and then the additional AG guidance 26 through 32. And I'll take comments. Yeah, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Last week we agreed to include the fair value also as an option in under the current value basis. And what I see the modifications to the test is in that line. However, I will not be so like black and white in the sense that we should not limit the operational, so current operational value only to assets held for operational capacity and the other way around for fair value. I will even leave it a bit broader because we cannot only focus on the, because even in the conceptual framework, we acknowledge that it's sometimes even difficult to define if an asset is held for operational or financial capacity. And apart from that, we also need to consider the qualitative characteristics and the constraints. For instance, when maybe one asset is for operational capacity, but it is maybe most cost efficient to obtain the fair value rather than estimating the, so that's why for both measures, for both also fair value or current operational value, I would leave it open so that people can decide, or at least in their accounting policy, so they have more flexibility. So that would be a suggestion.
Thanks, Camira, and I see support for that. And I think it's another manifestation of the issue we just talked about in the framework, that we can't have that automatic connect. There needs that greyness there. So I've got Todd and then Lindy.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And it's coming back to the comment that I made a little bit earlier under the conceptual framework, where a little bit similar, I think, to Camira, but this idea that it's not quite so black and white or binary. But I sort of thought of that in terms of you could split assets into components and think about it differently. But I think with what Camira says, if there's acceptance to that, that would probably address that issue.
Okay, so I think there's a general issue here, or there's an issue here which needs to be picked up, and we need advice on. And I think it does come into this componentization or not, the points about primary purpose and so on. So we need to get a shared view and consistency on that, because that, we've seen that in the framework, we're seeing that here. There's probably a 77 impact as well, and I think we need to just actually crack that as an issue. So I think if the request is to staff to actually focus on that as an issue, and we will need to have a shared view on that. I think we've got that. I thought we'd got that into 78, but I'm not, I think clearly we've not either been consistent or we haven't quite landed that issue. Now, I think with that instruction, I only want to take anything incremental, which is not associated with resolving that particular issue. I don't want additional comments on that issue at this stage. So if I can take Lindy and then Mike. Lindy.
Thanks. The comment is on paragraph 22 to 23, and that's where we're thinking about acquiring assets and you exchanging assets. In the previous version, we included fair value only as a way to measure that arrangement. Now we've changed it to current value. I don't agree, because I think the whole discussion there is around this transaction having commercial substance, and then you would use fair value. So I don't know if you want to relook at it or explain why, but I don't agree that you would just have current value, which could have operational value also to use to measure assets that are exchanged. I think it should only be fair value. Thanks.
Dave, any immediate response, or would you suggest taking that away?
We'll look at it again. The thinking was, Lindy, that we were just trying to be more generic in our wording. But I don't disagree with your points. I'm happy to look at that again.
Okay, thanks for that. So I think with that, we move on to the next issue.
So the next issue is the transitional provisions. So some members indicated that we should take a look at IPSAS 3 and consider the practicability of applying ED 78 retroactively. In the paper, we indicate that we think there is a strong link with IPSAS 3 already, so we don't think there's any additional changes that are required.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I think we're good on that. Move us on to the next issue.
So issue 3, at least the way I interpret the board discussion was members were happy with the agenda item, but didn't feel like what was in the agenda item flowed through very well to the IGs and BCs. So as a result, what staff has done is they've flowed through the issue paper a little better into those 2 sections of the document.
Thanks, Dave. I should say with these, you know, if there are further drafting amendments, then obviously those can go into the editorial process. And I think that probably applies across all 3 EDs, that any suggested edits can be taken into the editorial process. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. Dave, I had a question on, get my page reference right, IG 32, B, bottom of page 2 of issue 3. We introduced the term facilitate derecognition of the items. Why are we talking about derecognition? That says we write the asset off. I would have thought that should be impairment.
Can we take that away and have a, there are some subtleties there that I think it's not wise to try and deal with in time. So I think if we take that away and get that fixed. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other flags raised, so Dave, move us on.
Issue 4 relates to the derecognition, disclosure of unrecognized heritage property, plant, and equipment. The instruction from last week was that this disclosure requirement should be limited to heritage assets, and staff should consider where the disclosure requirement should be located. Because paragraph 7 talks about scoping, we thought that it was most appropriate to clarify disclosures related to scoping in the application guidance, as it clarifies a principle. So you'll see the proposed guidance in the attached appendix.
Thanks, Dave. And there's the clarity that this relates to heritage items as, rather than being a general, which was one of the instructions from the board. So I've got Patricia, Todd, and then Mike.
Thank you. I think that the point 3, paragraph 3, was not addressed yet. Relates to this subsequent expenditure on previously unrecognized assets.
Okay, I'll take comments and then ask staff to come back on that. I think they had tried to do that, but obviously you've still got concerns on that. Can I take Todd and then Mike, and then I'll go back to staff?
Thanks, Ian. I agree that this should be limited to heritage assets, but I think I expressed concern about this being located in the application guidance paragraphs, and it still doesn't work for me. And I wonder whether the solution is to actually move AG1 up to follow paragraph 2, so that we get the idea that heritage assets are within the scope of the standard right up front, and then we could move paragraph AG20 actually into the disclosure section, because for me it doesn't work to link it to paragraph 7, because paragraph 7 of the standard is not about disclosures. And as I think I pointed out earlier, having something in the application guidance, in my mind, is not necessarily going to get read and followed, because people tend to dip into application guidance if they haven't got a clear idea of what they should be doing and they read the standard. That's certainly the approach that I've come across in New Zealand.
Thanks, Todd. I think we have to be really careful on this one, because raising it into the core text actually means we're talking about an exception here. And I think the concern from board members was that putting it in the core text rather than the AGs raised it. And actually there was a danger that people would see this as the presumption rather than the exception. So I think we can certainly look at what you propose, but I think there were a considerable number of other board members that really expressed concern last time round that putting it in the core text rather than the AGs, which are still authoritative, and let's underline that, they are still authoritative text, gave it undue prominence. So I think we'll have a look at that and we may come back on that, but I think, you know, that may not command support. It didn't last time. Mike.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't want to re-debate it, but I think Todd's right. But please, can you have a look at it?
Okay, we will have a look at it, but I think we have to acknowledge that this is one where we can have two possible approaches and we'll take a view. And that may not satisfy all board members from what I'm hearing, because I heard very strong comments that the core text was not the place for this. So, you know, I think we can work up an alternative, but I'm not going to, you know, this can't be redeliberated ad nauseam just because there is a difference of views on this. We'll have to take a view on this. Okay, so we'll bring it back in February and we'll have a show of hands on that and we go whichever way. And then there's an SMC accordingly. Okay. Right, move us on to the next issue.
Issue 5 related to how we are going to reflect other EDs that are currently out for comment or that have come back from comment, the changes that they would have on IPSAS 17 and how we'd reflect those in ED 78. Our proposal is to reflect those changes in ED 78, but footnote each of them and indicate that because the other documents are still out for comment, that could impact the paragraphs that have been inserted into ED 78.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so I think we've dealt with that one satisfactorily. So take us on to issue 6.
Issue 6 related to revising the heritage scope exclusion, carrying it over from ED 78 to IPSAS 31. We've retained paragraphs 12 through 13 and revised paragraph 15. And then we've also carried over the disclosure requirements that we just discussed in reference to ED 78.
Okay, so clearly we've still got disagreement within the board on the disclosure item. So that is a consequential of the decision, that the final decision that we take next time. In terms of the scope exclusion, are there any comments on that? Okay. So issue 7, specific matters for comment.
So the next issue is specific matters for comment. As Ian just mentioned, we will be adding one or two more, at least one or two more SMCs. But for right now, we've updated the wording to SMCs 1 through 4, and we added an SMC, SMC 7 that relates to the disclosure requirements on unrecognized property, plant and equipment, heritage items.
Okay. Comments, Todd?
It's a small point, but I think we need to look at the order of these SMCs because they don't follow the logical order as you would be working through the material. And I think it's important that we get the order right.
Thanks, Todd. I think that's right. Okay. Anything else on SMCs, the changes that have been made? Scott.
Yeah, just a question on SMC 7. We asked for whether the additional disclosures, do we want to ask whether they agree with the disclosures we proposed? I guess, why do we only focus on asking for additional?
Well, I think it's a specific, isn't it? It's around a specific. So if we made that more general, I mean, it's really around do constituents agree with the approach?
Yes, I read the question differently. I read it as, are there other things you want to disclose we didn't? I think the way that sentence is worded is a little awkward.
Okay, so if we sort of made it that more kind of, we're asking for your comments on the approach proposed rather than leading, that would help you on that.
Yeah, I got a little confused what we're asking for there.
Okay, all right, that's useful. So Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I agree with Scott, and if we make the change that Scott's proposing, then I think we've got to be careful. Because I thought that question was also asking, should we require those disclosures where the item not recognised is other than a heritage asset?
Well, I think that brings us back to the problem that we have, which is actually that what members were looking for is that this is an exception only for heritage. And, you know, so I think this is just another manifestation of this issue that, you know, we clearly need to have another go round. I would suggest then we have another look at the SMC when we've landed where we're going to get to. But I think I'm right in saying that the sense from the board is the board doesn't want any potential get out in terms of non-recognition. What we're looking for is an appropriate disclosure for items that have not been recognised because they essentially fail the tests for measurement and therefore for recognition. So I think if we bring it back based on that, but it's based very clearly on that being the exception. So this is an exception to the specific instances that heritage should be recognised. Okay, so let's go on to item 8.
So the last item, members asked us to look at the BCs that were currently in IPSAS 17 and evaluate whether any of them need to be retained for ED 78. We reviewed all those BCs, all except one. Well, I guess they all related to changes made to IPSAS 17 as a result of IASB projects. Since ED 78 is a new standard, we don't need to retain those. Staff did recommend retaining, I think it was BC 6 that talks about a departure from IAS 16 related to recoverable amount. The rest aren't applicable anymore.
Thanks, Dave. On this, if I can make a comment as a member, I think it would help me to just have a bit more summary attached to that, which summarises what you just said. And I think there's also one BC which actually related to a change that we made, which brought in consistency with GFS. And I think it might be helpful to retain that one, because it was the first time that we'd actually made a change to our literature through annual improvements to the definition of defence items. And I think that's quite important to retain that. So if I can ask for that to be reviewed for both those two perspectives. Okay, so Dave, just so I think we've been through the items there. Some of them where we've nailed, there's others where some further work is required, and those will clearly need to come back for finalisation by the board in February. Todd.
Thanks, Ian, and I don't know if this is the right place to raise it, but there was one other issue that wasn't covered under issues 1 to 8 that I came across in looking at the material, and it seems that paragraph 12 has come back into this draft that we have before us today, even though it had been deleted earlier, and I think it does need to be deleted because I think paragraph 11 covers everything that we need. And paragraph 12 isn't needed, if that can be looked at as well.
Thanks. So just to locate us on that.
Todd, is that initial measurement? Because if it is, we're looking at that separately. We will look at that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, that's good. So Mike?
Thanks, Chair. And I know we've already voted on this standard, and I don't want to reopen the whole debate, but BC 41 just confused me. So maybe I could take it offline with Dave, but I don't know what BC 41 is talking about. And it seems to be talking about an alternative view, and I didn't think we had an alternative view on BC, on ED 78. So I'm confused with BC 41.
Okay, so I think if we can ask for that review there, please. Todd, and then I'm going to wrap this item up.
Yeah, in terms of sort of alternative view and those sorts of things, I do think it's important that somewhere, and I don't know whether it's an alternative view or on a basis for conclusions, but my issues with ED 76 and ED 77 do actually then come into ED 78 because we're using the measurement basis as defined and explained in those other two. So it needs to be somehow reflected, and I'm happy to work with staff as to whether that has to go through as an alternative view or a basis for conclusions in terms of me.
I agree, Todd. I can see that point of view. I think, have a look at it in terms of not only the wording in the BCs, but also it may well be in drafting the alternative view that actually it makes it clear that quite naturally there would be consequentials for 78 because we've drawn on that. And that may be quite a good way to highlight that. Ross, on process.
Yeah, so on that, I was along the lines of you already suggested, Ian. I don't think there's a need to, Todd, for you to particularly vote against this ED. But I do think we should add a BC noting your alternative view in the other two EDs to flag it to constituents. And depending on the outcome of those two EDs, there will be a knock-on effect to ED 78, or may not be, just so people are completely aware of where things stand.
Okay, and you will work with me sort of on that wording?
Yes.
That it reflects. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mike, final comment, and then I am going to move us on.
And that's what I thought maybe somebody was trying to do with BC 41, but it wasn't clear to me.
No, well, we certainly here, we need to look at BC 41, but I think, we'll look at that in the round. Okay, good. So I think we have cleared a number of items, but we still have some that will need to come back in February. And Ross, I think if staff can then update the preliminary approval subject to clearance of those. Okay, good. So I think with that, we'll see the updated version of the decisions and instructions. If anybody has any immediate comments on the version that you've got, if you can get those through to staff. Ross, really, I think we probably need those in the next day or so. Is that right, on the current version?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll take away the decisions instructions today in getting the preliminary approval on these documents. We'll update the document I circulated yesterday to reflect where we've landed with the preliminary votes, add the subject twos and the additional specific instructions we've received today. And we'll circulate that likely tomorrow or Thursday at the latest for board members to see. And if I could ask for comments back early next week before people disappear for holiday breaks, that would be very much appreciated. It should be fairly clear and concise in terms of what to review, so it won't be a long document, but I do want to make sure that we do have clearly articulated the takeaways and the subject twos so that we are going in the right direction for the February session.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I know that is an ask, but I think the decisions and instructions work well when everything's fresh in our minds rather than when we've been off, holidays and so on. So if you can do that, that would be much appreciated, and then it will allow staff to get a really good start in the new year on and make sure we've got what we need for the February check-in meeting. Okay, so Ross, I think we're back to you at that stage.
Yes, and thank you. And unfortunately, we're probably a lot shorter on time than we anticipated when we drew the agenda up. So what I would like to come back to is the program technical director session and the report there. that we talked about way back on December 1st. And I guess happily, in terms of the agenda item with the actual program, work program in it, we have gotten to the place we wanted in terms of approvals. Obviously, we have the February session where we need to clear those approvals finally, but in terms of adjusting the actual work program, I don't think there's any adjustments that are needed other than those minor editorials that were provided at
Ross,
the
sorry
beginning.
to interrupt you, but it does remind me that the one item that we haven't discussed, which I think we probably should, just before heading into that, is the
Exposure
period for the 4 exposure drafts. I am aware I promised members a discussion on this, and I do think now would be the appropriate point in time. Now, in the papers, you had a proposal to split the comment period into 6 months for 76 and 77, with a 4-month comment period for 78 and 79. I know there is a view that we should have 6 months for all 4 EDs. And I'd probably just like to say, are there any other proposals that members would like to make, or shall we just have a show of hands on whether members would support 6 months for all 4 or 6 months for 2 and 4 months for others? Yeah, Mike.
Before the week started, Chair, I was supportive of the original proposal, but I think because we've now landed on an alternative view being needed, and that has implications for those 3 EDs, I think we should have the same period for those 3 EDs.
Okay, and you'd propose 6 based on that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm seeing, thumbs up for the 6 months for all 4. Does anybody want to speak in favour of 6 and 4 split? Okay, so I think it's 6 months for all 4. Thanks, Ross. Apologies, but I thought actually that when you went in, I thought, I know the thing we haven't picked up. So back to you at that point, because I think that's germane in terms of the work program.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks for flagging that. You'll note that in the subject twos and the decisions instructions, we will put the dates in there. I think we already had 6 for all. Staff was kind of anticipating that's where we were going to land, but it's good to have the final approval. In terms of the program and technical directors report that we discussed on day 1, the one issue that I did note that we needed to return to was the excess capacity in terms of staff resource we would get by putting out this large chunk of EDs in the end of Q1 2021, and the proposal that we take forward a couple projects that are on our ad hoc theme B IFRS alignment, and particularly the IPSASB 18 segment reporting update for IFRS 8 and consideration of IAS 26 reporting by retirement plans. Now, I realize members don't have full information to make a yes or a no call at this point. Some might have views, but my proposal, having considered the initial feedback and thought it through and having talked to some others, is if members will permit this, that I bring back or the staff bring back project proposals that outline the key issues related to each of those proposed projects and highlight the timelines we think it will take, what the issues are, so that members can consider in March whether they want to take those forward or not, and dedicate the staff resources we'll have to address those issues or not. So I think that's really the proposal and the feedback I'd look for today on that discussion we started on December 1st.
And I think consistent with that, the request would be if board members have points they want to raise, that actually they drop you an email so that those can be considered as part of just scoping what those projects might involve. Lindy, Todd, in that order.
Thanks, and I'll send through my specific views on the 2. Assuming that one isn't accepted, is there another plan So I do wonder if there should be another alternative, because I have specific views on one of them in particular, and wonder if the board doesn't support at least one of them, what would be the alternative option? Thanks.
Yeah, so in terms of an alternative option, I'm happy to hear views of others and what they think we should do. Again, as I said on the first day of the meeting when we discussed this, it is limited resources available. We have to be careful we don't take on a full-scale, large-scale project because we don't have the resources to take on a major project. We are looking for minor containable projects similar to ED 79. So if some of the other IFRS ones might be more major. The other one that jumps to mind as a potential one to consider, but it might be slightly bigger, is the related party standard, which is on an older version. Might be one we might consider as well, but I do think there's a little bit more to that one. We have public sectorized that standard much more than the reporting segment standard. And I think it might take us a little bit more time to work through the public sector issues than what we have on the agenda, which is why that one is considered to be maybe slightly more from resource perspective. But again, happy to consider that as part of the discussion in March and to bring a more fully developed view on that and alternatives, especially if members do have alternatives in mind under theme B that they want considered.
Thanks, Ross. And I think it may well be, relevant in March to share with board members how you're proposing to allocate the resource within the team and the thinking that's gone behind that. I think that's going to be relevant, and the fact that we know now that we will have sort of staff resource available to support thinking about the issues for the March meeting, but also for the June and September meetings, because we won't do an initial analysis of the responses back on those 4 EDs until the December meeting next year now. So I think those are all sort of relevant factors. So Todd, then Mike, then Rod.
Thanks, Ian, and I share Lindy's views, and I'll name the project that I sort of have reservations about. And that's the one on IAS 26. I understand that there are very few countries around the world that have actually adopted IAS 26. I think it's seen as a very old standard, IASB, and I don't know whether we're going to get the value out of doing the project that we might anticipate at this point. So I think it's important to consider alternatives if we need to have 2 projects in this space.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Mike, then Rod.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's really great that you're thinking this way, Ross, in terms of trying to make sure everybody's got things to do. But I agree with Todd in terms of 26. And I think that was mentioned at the CAG meeting. The CAG meeting also flagged that maybe 18 is not as easy as you think it is. So maybe as you scope up the projects, if you decide in February that this is not a goer, then don't continue. So I just be as flexible as you can. I mean, I think 18 would be a great one to do, but I just worry about the CAG's comment that maybe that one is not as easy as you think.
Yeah, I think we do need to pay attention to that, and there's a trade-off here with all of these. One of the things I think we will need to factor in is also, the impact on our overall suite of standards as well. Because, for example, 26, there's a counter argument there that a number of people have raised the gap in our standards, notwithstanding the fact that it is an old standard, and so there's arguments backwards and forwards, and I think we need those. We need to understand the concerns as well as the pros and so on, and then have a look at it. But it will be within the the constraints that we have. Rod.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Ross, for your presentation that you gave us the other day. Well done. Ross, you and the staff have been through a pretty ambitious period. There's been a lot on the go. A lot has happened, a lot of very, very good work. I'm glad to see you putting future work in the context of workload, what's possible, what's not possible. Just wondering, are staff getting appropriate time off? Is there training time for staff? How are you feeling about the whole package? I mean, we talked to you about things that need to be done, but as a staff manager, you have a lot of other obligations as well that have to be met. So I'm just wondering how you're feeling about all of that.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Yeah, there's no doubt it's been a tough year, and it's been a tough year for everybody. Learning to work virtually, I think, brings its own challenges just above workload, to be honest, like creating proper boundaries, finding times away, disconnecting from your workspace when you live in it. I think these are challenges everyone's up against. That being said, I do think we've got a full staff complement at the moment, and our work program is balanced and fair. And I do think people have had time throughout the year to find their times away. And I know a lot of the staff are looking forward to the back end of December where we're going to get another break. I would highlight that IFAC has been keeping an eye on this across the organization. They've been very generous by providing additional time off in addition to our already generous vacation allotment, to make sure people are getting time away with friends and family and to really disconnect in our new virtual reality that we're living and working in at the moment. So, to be honest, my biggest stressor at the moment is trying to find the time to actually use all the vacation I have and then do something meaningful with my time when I can't go anywhere. I normally I'm quite happy to take my vacation because I look for opportunities to get away and do something different, but I'm being stuck at home. When I take my time now, it's really finding those things that get me out of the house and fit with the current lockdown that we're in, and sometimes work's a welcome distraction from that as well. So yeah, there's no perfect answer at all, and I know every staff has their own unique challenges with the current situation, but I think we, as a whole, we've managed through the pandemic as best as I could have expected. If you had have asked me that question at the beginning of the year, Rod, when I didn't know about the pandemic, I wouldn't think I'd be in the position to give you the answer that I've just given you, given the changes we've had to deal with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. I think the other thing that we had hoped we would find more time for during this meeting was that just to get some initial discussion going on the, what we should include in the future work programme. I think the presentation that Ross gave the other day was a good start point to get the thinking going. It would certainly be helpful if, there are additional thoughts from members and TAs on sort of, topics that we potentially should be on our long list of projects, because we want to sort of cast the net wide at this point in time and then to work out where the priorities go. And I think, we will, as ever, need to be cognizant of the points that have just been made in terms of the constraints that we have: staff time, board time, stakeholders. So we need to balance all of those off. But at the moment, what we're looking for is let's make sure we've got our long list, and then we can work with that as we have our discussions through March and June next year. So Ross, anything else then from a staff perspective that you need at this stage?
No, nothing other than just to say a big thank you to all the volunteers, board members, technical advisors, observers, task force members. It's been a tough year, and we couldn't have been where we are today with our approvals without the volunteer time and the commitment that everybody's put into this process. I, just want to thank everybody officially.
Absolutely. I think you've done the resume that I was, or the summary I was going to give. I think, it has been a really tough year. But I think, with staff support, I think we as a board have actually come through it with huge credit. And as chair, I'm really proud of what we've achieved as a team. And I do say this, it is absolutely a team. We all contribute to this. So thank you everyone for what you've done during a truly extraordinary year, and I hope in the accounting sense that extraordinary items don't happen. This is a unique year, and we look forward to 2021 being a very, hopefully a very different year, even although I know the first quarter or so will still be challenging, given lockdowns, vaccines, and availability, and so on. So with that, I would just say thank you, everyone. Do hope you get a break over the coming weeks, and really look forward to seeing those of you that are returning next year. I think, we do say particular thank yous to James, who isn't here, but particularly Michelle and Rod. It's been fantastic having you on the journey over the last 6 years. And as has been said, please do keep in touch. You have been great supporters. We've really enjoyed working with you, and we hope that that you'll carry on being interested in what we do. And when we have social do's in your part of the world, please do feel free to join. You're part of the family. So that's great. And I think with that, I will wrap up. We did say that we would have a board in camera session. I'm happy to have a board in camera session if the members aren't too tired on that. But I suspect, and I think we have great sympathy for Tom, bearing in mind the time that it is. What I'd suggest is we do have a board in camera session at the conclusion of the February check-in, which will be the final conclusion on this, and probably that's the time to actually have it. So unless anybody's dying to have one, I'd suggest we wrap up at this point. And just say thank you, everyone. Have a great break, and all the best for 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Cheers all. Bye-bye.
Happy
Happy holidays.